Chapter 15 of Fact Stranger Than Fiction by John Patterson Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Home again and European trip. It was with great pleasure that I once again found myself a bona fide resident of my own dear city of Cleveland. True it is that, during our residence in Washington, I lost no opportunity of visiting our home and of remaining as long as I consistently could, but that fell far short of a regular permanent abode. Our old friends and associates flocked around us and gave us just the hearty welcome which we expected and needed, and it did not take me longer than a few days on my return to Cleveland to settle down at my desk and take up the study of that jealous mistress, the law, where I had laid it down 10 years before. In fact, I had kept in touch with her even while we resided in Washington by aiding to some extent my son, Theodore B. Green, in his studies while he was a student in the Howard Law School, which made my return to the practice comparatively easy. That my recitals may not become monotonous or wearisome, I shall make reference in this chapter to only 2 cases out of hundreds which engaged my attention during the early years after my return. The first was that of Ohio versus Wade Lee, a man who was indicted for murder in the first degree. It was a difficult case, in which I was ably assisted by Horace Neff, Esquire, a son of Judge William B. Neff, whose name appears in a previous chapter of this story. Wade Lee and the deceased had engaged in a wordy war at an early hour the day before Christmas, and separated, breathing out mutual threats. Later in the day, Wade, after having made some Christmas purchases, entered a saloon, laid his parcels down in the bar, and bought and began to drink a glass of beer. While he was so engaged in drinking the beer, the deceased entered the bar-room, presumably for the purpose of buying a drink, but seeing Wade standing at the bar, he turned and left the room through the swinging doors which were within the outer door. He was immediately followed by Wade, who shot and killed him almost on the threshold of the door as he stepped out upon the sidewalk. Wade thereupon returned to the bar-room, picked up his packages which he had left lying on the bar, and left the place through the back door, his glass not yet being emptied. By the side of the body of the deceased, which was still lying on the sidewalk, was found a dangerous-looking knife opened by a close friend of Wade. The ready inference was, of course, that the knife was the property of the deceased man, and that he had assaulted Wade with it between the doors, outer and inner, before Wade shot him in self-defense. The foregoing was the backbone of the defense, at any rate, and it succeeded, the defendant Wade being found guilty of assault and battery only. So anxious was the state's attorney that the jury should not recommend mercy in finding the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree, and thus fix his punishment at life imprisonment. And so strenuously and earnestly did he argue in that behalf that he evidently forgot that the defendant left his packages and returned for them after he had committed the murder, that he had not finished drinking his beer when he followed deceased out of the bar-room, and that he left finally through a back door. I pointed out to the honorable judge, after the trial was ended and the jury had been excoriated and summarily dismissed and the defendant fined and sentenced to the House of Correction, that the defense that Wade was assaulted by the deceased with the big knife as he, Wade, was leaving the premises, and that he shot him to protect his life and limbs, would have fallen to the ground, and the defendant would have been convicted of murder in the first degree instead of assault and battery, if the prosecuting attorney had not inadvertently failed to call the attention of the jury to those facts which would have left no doubt in the minds of the jurymen that Wade left that room for the sole purpose of killing his victim. With a look of blank amazement and disappointment, they both turned away from me, and the farce of that prosecution was ended. The daily papers carried glowing accounts of our success in that case, and it added much to our professional popularity. The other case, which I shall refer to, was of more than local interest, inasmuch as many newspapers in remote sections of the country noticed it, and the General Assembly of the State of Ohio subsequently cured what seemed to be a legal defect by appropriate legislation. Dr. John L. Hoyer, an aged and venerable-looking white man, who had been tried, convicted, fined, and committed to the House of Correction of the city of Cleveland, sent for me while incarcerated to visit him in the prison and give him such legal advice in the premises as was needful for his welfare, and especially for the fact that a piece of jewelry of his personal belongings taken from him for safekeeping on his entering the prison was lost or stolen, and he could obtain no satisfactory explanation as to its whereabouts. Having been personally acquainted with the patriarchal, bewhiskered old gentleman for many years, I hastened to his side for the purpose above mentioned. He was brought out into the audience-room, accompanied by one of the prison guards, who steadfastly refused to leave his side for a moment, in order that I might confer with his prisoner professionally. I appealed to the superintendent, with the result that he told me point blank that the rule under which the guard was acting was one of long standing, and he would continue to enforce it. This left me no alternative except to have recourse to the Director of Charities and Corrections, the Honorable Harris R. Cooley, a big-hearted, kindly disposed Christian gentleman, who, I may here digress to say, is a true and valuable friend of all colored people. Mr. Cooley, after conferring with the superintendent and getting the same answer in effect that he had given to me, gave me the information which I had already received. So finding, according to the slang phraseology of the time, that I was up against it with no prospect of having a private conference with my client, I determined to carry my complaint to the mayor of Cleveland, the Honorable Newton D. Baker, now and for a long time Secretary of War at Washington. After a reasonable delay, I was ushered into the presence of that august but kindly functionary, and at once made known to him my case, as I have stated it in the foregoing. Mr. Baker, lawyer and statesman as he was and is, seemed surprised to learn the status of this affair, and immediately called up one of the attorneys for the city, and placed it in his hands for a brief and opinion in the premises. After that we had a short conversation, which seemed mutually agreeable to us, and I took my departure. After the lapse of several days, I received by mail from the distinguishing gentleman a document of which the following is a true copy. October 8, 1914. Honorable Newton D. Baker, Mayor of Cleveland. My dear Mr. Baker, I beg leave to reply as follows to your inquiry of yesterday with reference to the right of the superintendent of the workhouse to refuse the request of a person sentenced for a misdemeanor for an opportunity to have a private conversation with his attorney. I've examined the matter carefully and find that the law applicable to this case lays down in substance this fundamental proposition. A jailer charged with the duty of protecting and preserving the jail and of keeping the prisoners safely until he is relieved by legal authority of their custody has a large discretion in determining at what time, under what circumstances, and what persons he will permit to enter the jail or to have access to the prisoners, a discretion which he must exercise according to his own conscience and judgment, uncontrolled by the conscience and judgment of others. Thus it has been held that a sheriff, for instance, may require whoever may seek admission into the jail to submit their persons to a proper orderly examination or search. If they do not consent, admission to the jail or access to the prisoners may be refused. If they persist in remaining, they may be treated as trespassers and ejected. Likewise, in England, it was held that where a material witness for a person accused was confined in prison, the jailer should allow the attorney for the accused to see the witness in his presence, but properly refuse to allow the attorney to see the witness apart. The Constitution and statutes of Ohio are silent upon this subject. As to the workhouses, and the statutes simply vest the management and the proper city official and clothe the superintendent of the workhouse with police powers. We are therefore relegated to common law, and the decision in this and other states, which read as follows: It is a power inherent in a workhouse superintendent to prescribe reasonable rules for the government of the prison, and to enforce obedience to them by the infliction of proper punishment. The court's opinion, so far as applicable, was as follows: The superintendent of a workhouse is a public officer, an executive officer perhaps, charged with the government in a great measure and the maintenance of good order in the city prison, and in the discharge of these duties he is given and must be given a wide discretion. It is necessary that good order be preserved in these institutions. Reasonable rules and regulations must be made for the government of the inmates. The statutes provide for reasonable rules and regulations in the government and the punishment administered in county jails, which are to be submitted to the common pleas judges. And the necessity for such rules and regulations applies with still greater force to workhouses such as this, where a large number of prisoners are confined, many of them for long periods of time, where they are compelled to work under the superintendence of officers of the workhouse as punishment for criminal offenses. With such a large body of men gathered together in such a prison, reasonable rules and regulations are necessary, and it is necessary that these rules and regulations should be enforced, and that the superintendent of such an institution should have the power to punish within limitations and restrictions. It must be remembered that this is the case of a man convicted of a crime who has lost thereby his rights as a citizen. The superintendent is absolutely responsible for the custody of the accused. If it were not inherent in the official to make all reasonable rules for the government of the prisoners, it is quite obvious that he might be frequently held liable for dire consequences which his best efforts and judgment could not control. He must therefore be permitted to exercise his discretion to determine in each particular case what the extent of the restriction upon the prisoner should be. That an attorney is concerned in this case, I conceive, can give no greater rights. It is therefore my judgment that the superintendent of the workhouse was perfectly within his rights in refusing the request in this case. Very truly yours, signed Arthur F. Young, Assistant City Solicitor. My disappointment and dissatisfaction was rapidly increasing. My faith in my original contention was increasing rather than diminishing, and I determined to see what redress, if any, I could obtain at law. A mandamus was applied for, the writ issued, all parties were in court, and the defendant's demand was adjudged to be reasonable and lawful by the Honorable Charles J. Estep, one of the judges of our Court of Common Pleas. Thereupon I took my client aside, talked with him, and advised him as to his legal rights in the premises, and afterwards wrote a check for the amount of my fee, which he readily signed, and the famous case was ended. I desire to record here an incident of my life which has brought to me much satisfaction, and I trust benefit to the cause of all the colored Americans. I refer to the time when I was elected to Congress, as I denominate the transaction, by the colored people of Cleveland in mass, meeting assembled. It came about in this way. Senate Bill 6060 of the 63rd Congress, 3rd session, had passed the Senate and was in the hands of the Immigration Committee of the House, of which Judge Burnett of Alabama was chairman. On page 8 of said bill, beginning with line 8, were the following words: that after 4 months from the approval of this act, in addition to the aliens who are hereby excluded from admission into the United States, the following persons shall also be excluded from admission thereto, to wit, all members of the African or black race. Some very able lawyers were of opinion that the phraseology of that provision would even exclude colored citizens of the United States out of the country from re-entering the same. Quite reasonably, the colored people of Cleveland, who were informed, became alarmed, especially for the reason that it had gone through the Senate without opposition. A mass meeting of colored citizens was immediately called to meet in St. John's AME Church at a time specified. They crowded, packed all parts of the large structure, the number being estimated at 2,500. Speeches were made, a committee on resolutions appointed, of which this writer was made chairman. A preamble and set of resolutions, which this writer had in his pocket, was unanimously adopted without the changing of a syllable, and I was unanimously elected to go to Congress at Washington and use my best endeavors with our own and other delegates to have that obnoxious proviso eliminated from the bill. Also, a collection was then and there taken to defray all expenses and compensate me for services to be rendered. It goes without saying that, to paraphrase the language of Julius Caesar on a momentous occasion, I went, I saw, I conquered, and returning home, my report was received with acclamations of unalloyed enthusiasm and approval. Judge Burnett of Alabama, chairman of the Immigration Committee, although a Southerner, received me courteously, heard my argument against the proviso, and promised me that he would oppose the measure when the bill came before the House for consideration. He kept his word in spirit and in truth, for when the speaking commenced, he divided his time amongst several of the members known to be opposed to that feature of it, and thereby greatly augmented the sentiment against it. Needless to say, the whole bill was defeated, nor have the enemies of the colored American to this day been able to resurrect it. Judge Burnett since then is gone to that bourne from which no traveler returns, but let it be here recorded that while his obsequies were being conducted in far-away Alabama, there was at least one colored man in the bleak North, on the shore washed by blue Lake Erie, who deeply sighed and mourned his untimely end because of that humane patriotic deed in behalf of those of the African or black race. Time sped rapidly by, so fast indeed that it was scarcely appreciated, and ere long we found ourselves at the beginning of the year 1909. Speaking of the flight of time, I'm tempted to insert here a few lines quoted from The Improvement of the Mind by Isaac Watts, mentioned in another part of this story. I reproduce these lines because they are well calculated to inspire and energize the minds of the young, one of the principal reasons I have in view in writing this book. The lines follow. Nor let soft slumber close your eyes before you've recollected thrice the train of actions through the day. Where have my feet chose out the way? What have I learnt where'er I've been? From all I've heard, from all I've seen, what know I more that's worth the knowing? What have I done that's worth the doing? What have I sought that I should shun? What duty have I left undone? Or into what new follies run? These self-inquiries are the road that leads to virtue and to God. My professional labors during the 4 preceding years having been extra exacting, Mrs. Green and I decided to spend a short vacation in England and on the continent. So, grip in hand and frugal luggage in the hold of the good ship Carmania, we bade adieu to our good friends Mr. and Mrs. Samuel R. Scotland and family of Brooklyn, New York, and set sail for far distant shores. After a pleasant voyage of about 3 days, we hove to and attempted to make a landing on one of the Azore Islands, but the condition of the sea was such as to make it extra hazardous, so we tarried in the offing for only a brief space, while 1 or 2 of the most daring boatmen rowed out to us and exchanged greetings, to say nothing of a few bananas and oranges. Our next stop was at Funchal, the capital city of the Madeira Islands, a province of Portugal. We were informed that we were then distant about 600 miles from the west coast of Africa, a fact which we could easily believe, for the mercury even then in the month of January was at about 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun, and luscious strawberries were being hawked around for sale, fresh from the vines. After writing and mailing pictorial postal cards to our friends at home, riding in the bobsleds over the damp, smooth cobblestones, drinking of the rich Madeira wine to the health of Portugal and her colony, inspecting the ancient castle well up on the top of a high hill overlooking the ocean, and scanning the old cathedral and the pretty little green cemetery with its sacred dead, we were ready to embark again, and ere long we had weighed anchor and were en route to Gibraltar, but not before a swarm of amphibious boys had earned numerous dimes and quarters by diving for them from the very high upper deck of the big ship Carmania, and recovering them under the surface of the water. At daybreak the next morning we were entering the bay or harbour of Gibraltar. I of all the passengers was on the deck alone. I beheld with awe for the first time the towering, majestic masts of the Rock of Gibraltar, and enthused as I was, there came trooping into my mind some lines of Virgil relating to the storm-beaten companions of Aeneas, as they entered a bay where an island forms a harbour by its jutting sides, whereby each wave coming from the main is broken and divides as it enters the deep creeks. On either side are huge rocks and twin cliffs which tower frowning towards the sky, beneath whose peaks the water's surface far and wide lies safe and still. I also saw in the offing, happy thought, the huge grey hulks of our touring fleet, which, on its world-encircling voyage during the administration of President Roosevelt, had just anchored in that bay. I saluted Old Glory at the masthead as the envious streaks of the rising sun did lace the severing clouds in the east, and almost forgetting the famous rock, gazed with filial pride upon them. We spent Sunday there, and attended divine service in the Episcopal Cathedral. The sermon by the learned divine was apropos to the occasion. The destructive earthquake which demolished a goodly portion of Sicily and Calabria having scarcely ceased its ravages, the majesty of the great British Empire was easily evident, in the erect forms and stern demeanour of the local troops, that look and bearing which is equally observable in the appearance of the Horse Guards in Whitehall, the lions couchant on the pedestal of the Nelson Monument, or the Queen's Own in the shadow of Arthur's Seat. At night we were once more riding the bounding billows, and for the first time since our departure from the port of New York, old Neptune asserted himself, and the ladies of our set seriously complained of sea sickness. It occurred just after midnight, when, awaking from a sound sleep, we became conscious of the fact that our huge ship was rolling in troublous seas. Our captain called it a fresh gale, which was no stranger to the Gulf of Lyons, off the south coast of France, through which we were then passing. Quite a bit of patience and some care on the part of the ship's surgeon were necessary before we were all again in normal condition, but in the course of a day or so, landing in the safe port of Genoa, where Christopher Columbus many a year before had feasted his eyes, our nausea was quickly dissipated, and like most of our transient ills, forgotten. The great cathedral, the Campo Santo, with its unapproachable sculptures sacred to the dead, the birthplace of Christopher Columbus, and the many quaint and interesting objects which met our eager gaze, made our short stay there long to be remembered. Our destination, however, earthquake or no earthquake, was Naples, Narpoli, as the natives euphoniously called it. And when on the following day our ship anchored at a dock, and we stood upon the pier, to my unutterable astonishment a voice rang out in very good English. "Hello, Senator Green!" I exclaimed. "For God's sake, who are you?" "Why, don't you know me?" he replied. "I'm Nick, who used to peddle fish in Cleveland." Sure enough, it was not sufficient to be saluted by name in Vienna, Paris, and on Ludgate Hill. Even here, on the shores of the Bay of Naples, I could not escape them. Fortunate for us all, however, that Nick discovered us, for his knowledge of all things pertaining to Naples added twofold to our amusement and instruction while we remained there. If I were writing a book of travels, I could finish it by plunging into the details of this visit, but such is not the case, and I must hasten on. However, I must state that the Museum of Curios from the exhumed city of Pompeii, the aquarium with wonders of the sea which we had never dreamed of, the great cathedral, the ruins of Pompeii, and the volcano of Vesuvius are a few of the sights which every one must search out and see. I will transcribe here an account of my ascent of Mount Vesuvius, which I wrote immediately after, while the facts were fresh in my mind, and the inspiration still actuated me. The description follows. Especially interesting at the present time are my brief notes on my visit to and ascension of Mount Vesuvius, in view of the delightful, but I must confess somewhat arduous ascent of this wonderful volcano, which I made in company with the linguistic German Vade Kuhn, who was to me a source not more of convenience than of diversion and amusement. I regret now that I did not note the name of the town or village at which we hired our carriage for the first part of our trip. I note, however, that we paid each 11 shillings for room in the carriage and a saddle horse and guides. Then we began to Mount Vesuve, as our experiment was euphoniously called. A drive of from 3 to 5 miles brought us to our first station or halting place. Here we discarded our carriage, laid aside all unnecessary clothing and appendages, and stimulated ourselves with a potation of some mild but invigorating wine which our guides denominated Nica Vesuve wine which in very fact was pressed from grapes which had grown, in the language of Macaulay, on the soil which had been fertilized by the fiery deluge of a volcano. The foregoing preliminaries having been arranged, we each mounted his saddle horse, and with bated breath proceeded onward and upward. To properly appreciate the romantic novelty of our position, one must not forget that neither of us had ridden horseback for many years. At least this writer can aver that it was the first time in some 25 years that he had bestridden a horse, or any other quadruped, and his awkwardness on this occasion is more easily imagined than described. To add to the embarrassment and discomfort of our condition, the guides, who clung each to the tail of the horse ridden by his respective traveller, had a way of cudgelling the horse into a brisk trot, followed by a wild gallop, at intervals of every half mile, when we would be borne, as by the wind, through space, at the imminent risk of being thrown over the horse's head and injured. As it was, we each rode during those spurts more on the neck than on the back of our horse, clinging with might and main, like another John Gilpin, to the neck and mane of the horse for safety. We shall never forget those spurts. Strange to relate, when the horses slowed up and we summoned courage to look sheepishly behind, expecting to discover the guides in the dim distance, there they were, at the very heels of our fiery steeds, still clinging to the tails, cudgel in hand, but no longer shouting their auk, 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 which had served to spur the horses to that velocity well nigh fatal to us. Upon the whole, I'm not sure that I would not as willingly take my chances with the present eruption as with the hardy mountaineers and their horses under similar conditions. From time to time during our ascent through ashes ankle deep in fine cinders, we would come to little isolated circular enclosures constructed of the slag, which was omnipresent and tenanted by a lonely Dago, who offered us still more and more of the nice Vesuve wine. The main of the wine merchants met under these circumstances was such as their bearing was at once so imperious and persuasive that we never refused to patronize them, with the result that our spirits never once flagged, and we felt that we were all jolly good fellows as we climbed higher and higher. There came a time, however, when our horses refused to go another inch. They would not budge. What was done, what to do, a glance told us both. There confronted us, as if genii of the lava beds, 4 other stalwart guides, 2 carrying a leather strap looped at both ends, which being thrown over one of their shoulders, they clung to it in front, while we tenaciously hung on behind. The 2 other guides each grasped his traveller near his hips, and boosted him upwards while we all climbed. Although we were climbing mountain heights, yet it seemed to me as though I were in a veritable hell where all the fires had gone out. Oh, it was dismal. Serial rows of excoriae, piled like Ossa on Pelion, little mountains on the mountainside. If all the cinders raked out of all the blast furnaces in the whole world from that time whereof the memory of man runneth not to the contrary had been dumped on the sides of that mountain, they would have been as nothing compared to the vast accumulation of slag which that terrible volcano had vomited forth in even our own Christian era. But now we come to the region of the clouds. Yes, we are actually enveloped in a cloud, and we are in danger of being drenched. Strange to say, we encounter another group which contains in the midst a lady. Nica Italian lady, says my guide. Yes, and a very brave lady too, if she is not literally carried. We leave them behind. Goodbye. I shall always recall with romantic interest the lady I met within the cloud. Now we are nearing the summit. Already somewhat of grumbling and sputtering are audible to us. Up here on the shoulder or summit of this volcano are to be seen here and there small fissures, out of which issues slowly small quantities of lava. My guide demands a copper coin of me, which I hand to him. He fuses it into some of the lava, making for me a cup or nest-like souvenir of this arduous, if not perilous, trip. I have a feeling that where fissures abound, the crust upon which we tread must be thin, if not friable. Tread lightly, Pat. Nevertheless, I approach the edge of the great smoky, steamy crater. I lie upon my stomach and peer cautiously into the bowels of this mysterious mountain, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell. Nothing to be seen save blackness, steam, condensed gloom, an inferno, sure enough. Be careful, sir, shouts my intelligent, thoughtful guide. An English gentleman did that a year or 2 ago. The crust at the edge crumbled, and he went head first down into the crater. Ye gods, I pray thee, let me go hence. This writer wriggled backwards, afraid even to stand up, and speedily put space between him and that entrance to the worse than Stygian darkness and gloom. Now comes the descent. Farewell, Creator. Farewell, white human, fleecy clouds. Farewell, Vesuvius, and O you mortal engine, whose rude throat the immortal Jove's dread clamours counterfeit, farewell. Down, down, on another side we go, by leaps and bounds through the fine pea-like cinders, striking in our descent at times almost up to our hips in this harmless debris. Down, down, until finally we reach vegetation, reach our horses, which have been brought to this point for us, and soon again we are mounted in our carriage, and ere long we reach our first station, where we don our discarded apparel, and finish our descent, followed by as hungry-looking, clamorous a rabble as ever one could wish to escape, who pleaded for, aye, in some instances even demanded such small coins as we could give them. One little fellow, not to be outdone, followed our carriage on a run for at least a mile, nor would he desist until he received some small token of our admiration of his courage and persistency. The village next, then the train, after that the lovely bay of Naples, and Narpoli, Naples then in mourning herself. The remains of Pompeii, which the ashes of Vesuvius completely buried and hermetically sealed up, stand a stone's throw from the volcano, and of course we visited them and rambled through them, accompanied by our guide, Mrs. Green, and Mrs. Graham, and this writer stood amidst the ruins of an ancient temple of Isis, while Dr. Graham took a snapshot of us. It still exists somewhere, I know not in whose possession. The strange and weird scenes which confront one while strolling amidst these ruins, which carry us back or bring down to us the dwellings, the commercial transactions, the frescoes, and even the petrified bodies of some of the inhabitants of this old town, as they existed in the year 79 A.D., are well worthy of our consideration, and at times the writer feels like exclaiming with the psalmist, "What is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou visitest him?" No brief description en passant can do justice to this subject. One must either visit the place or read accounts of it in books of travel and cyclopedias. The following morning we were en route for the eternal city, Rome, and as we were whirled through the beautiful scenery and inhaled the odoriferous atmosphere, redolent of the sweet fragrance of orange blossoms and flowers of varied hues, we felt that we were indeed fortunate under the circumstances, and enjoyed it beyond description. End of chapter 15.